But also a little background at now, there were two competing resolutions. I believe there is still a resolution supporting something, supporting a Nordic model intervention for prostitution. It's a means of ending demand for prostitution by arresting all the clients of people who pay for sex with what I would refer to as sex workers. We had a resolution for the full decriminalization of sex work. And this is not going to be a real policy conversation. It's going to be about finding common cause. But we withdrew our resolution in the spirit of not fighting anymore. We don't want to fight you. Instead, there is a new resolution. You have the opportunity to vote on this on Sunday. And the goal of this resolution that we have introduced instead of our preferred policy priority is to educate and inform members at now of both policies, Nordic model interventions like end demand, as well as full decriminalization. We asked members of now to commit to learning about this complex issue so that you can make informed decisions in 2027 on resolutions around sex trade reform. So you can take a look at that resolution and vote on both those resolutions on Sunday. But all right, do we have Melodie KG with us yet? Yes, we do. My good colleague. All right, I've been talking enough. I would like to introduce the other panelists. We have Jessica Peñaranda from Reframe Health and Justice, and my colleague Melodie KG from New Moon Network. Jessica, would you please introduce yourself, who you are, your connection to this work?
Can you all hear me? Yes, yeah. Amazing. Yeah, happy Saturday, happy afternoon, wherever you are. Thankful to be in this space with you all and be doing one of the things that I find is one of our most important practice and skill in our communities is the practice to be in dialogue and to be really courageous, to be present and really listening to one another. So as Savannah had shared, my name is Jessica Peñaranda. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a partner at Reframe Health and Justice. We are a consulting practice that works at the intersection of criminalization, harm reduction, and really thinking about how we can world build. And this project that we worked with New Moon is just about that, right? I come into this work through violence prevention, harm reduction, and organizing alongside people who have been pushed to the margins and still built systems of care anyway, in spite of that. I've supported many people through violence, arrest, housing loss, family separation. I've worked alongside people in the sex trades and survivors of human trafficking, doing mutual aid work, undocumented workers, navigating so much exclusion, and just communities really thinking about how do we survive and outside of these formal systems. I want to name that my lineage in this work is really shaped by my own lived experiences as someone that came into understanding all of the systems of oppression through a framework very early on that is central to feminism as well, and also thinking a little bit more about that. What does it mean to be a migrant? What does it mean to be separated as a young person? What does it mean to be a survivor of violence and want to support community? And also like people like Lorena Borjas and the legacy of Cecilia Gentili, who really was a bridge maker in the trans movement and in the sex worker rights movement. And of course, the leadership of Black, Brown, Indigenous, trans women and sex workers and survivors of trafficking who have always been at the center of survival, even when our institutions were not. So, I stand in relationship here with organizing spaces like you all, and also with partners in harm reduction and in just generally our justice work, who are actively fighting for dignity and safety, right? Not just the inclusion of our communities, and that we're talking about people's lives and people's safety and people's right to exist without any punishment, and also the right to joy and pleasure. And so I'm thankful to be in this conversation with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We're really, really thrilled to have you here and to have been working with you. Next, I'd like to introduce my close colleague who's in Minneapolis, Melodie KG. Melodie, would you like to tell us who you are, what you do, what are you all about?
Absolutely. Thanks, Savannah, and thanks, Jessica. Glad to see you're here as well. Hi, everyone. My name is Melodie KG. I use she or they pronouns. I am here in Minneapolis, as Savannah said. I am the co-director for New Moon Network. We're an intermediary funder and capacity builder for the sex worker rights movement in the US and supporting survivors as well. I come to this work as a person of color and someone with lived experience in the sex trade and a sex worker of many different modalities. I'm also a consultant on a number of projects, mostly relating to foundations and government programs who are trying to do good community outreach ethically and at the speed of trust in their communities. And so a lot of my work is helping institutions and people who represent institutions understand community values, especially ones from marginalized identities, understanding the intersection of criminalization, stigma, and our collective ability to sort of thrive. And so, like I said, my work is really centered around helping folks understand, the messy middle, as we like to call it, right? Understanding how marginalization of any one group of people really affects all of us. And my goal here today is just to help folks understand different perspectives about what it means to be in this work as a sex worker, and also to hold feminist values, because those conversations don't often happen, especially with nuance intact and with everyone's dignity left intact at the end of the conversation. And I really think that it's important, as Jessica said, to be able to be in dialogue about these issues because they affect all of us. And even if you disagree with certain aspects, that's okay. I hope you're able to just sort of listen and reflect on what your own values are and how they either work with or don't with this framework, and just engage in whatever level you are able to. So thank you for having me, and hope you enjoy the chat.
Thank you, Melodie. It's an honor to work with you in this work, and I'm really glad you could join us today, too. And my name is Savannah Sly. I have been a sex worker since I was 18. I am now 42. It has been how I have supported myself, my friends when they are in need, and now currently my family, for my entire life. I have had lots of other jobs. One of my proudest accomplishments was working with the ACLU in Washington State on their technology and privacy portfolios, where it had nothing to do with sex work, but I come from a family that was impacted by the war on drugs. My father was in prison for a long time. My mom was a single mom. And then I became a sex worker, and I started to experience a similar pattern of policing and surveillance that reminded me of the war on drugs. And then I became a just kind of knee-jerk reaction, won't let this happen, advocate for sex workers' rights, stumbling and learning along the way. And after over a decade of doing that work and working with hundreds of sex worker advocates and survivor advocates, I have decided to lay down the sword. I personally am done fighting with other feminists. I'm not here to change your mind today. I'm not here, none of us are here to glamorize sex work. We are here to advocate for our existence. We would love to be included, in an organization like NOW. But I think the priority right now with what is going on in the country is to put our disagreements aside enough to work together against our common enemy, which is huge and incredibly dangerous and has a lot of momentum behind it. So that's the priority today. Today, we're going to be discussing how this debate has affected our work and ourselves and our communities. And we're also going to be talking about a pilot program that the three of us worked on recently, called the Common Cause Initiative, which is to identify shared policy priorities and values amongst advocates with lived experience in the sex trade who have opposing viewpoints on policy. So before we get into Common Cause, and I believe that Alex dropped the link in the chat, some of you are in a room, some of you are on Zoom. If you want to check out the results and the findings of that pilot program, we'll make that link available however we can. But before we talk about the pilot program, Jessica, if we could start with you, as an advocate who has worked with sex workers and survivors, can you share a bit about how this debate has affected people you know or work with, your advocacy, and the communities you serve?
Yeah, so I have been doing, more traditional direct services for many years, as well as doing policy advocacy and movement building. Most of the work that I have been doing with survivors of trafficking and people in the sex trades has been around how to access resources, right? So, there's always been a push and a pull around. We have laws, we have definitions, we have all these tools to identify folks, and a lot of the focus has been on identifying folks. And a constant barrier that has existed is that the identification has not often led to a robust amount and an equitable amount of resources for what people need, right? Once folks are identified, including people in the sex trade, needing basic things like housing, employment, legal representation, access to healthcare, right? And so what it's created is really a system where we have had to gatekeep resources from folks. And so as a service provider, who has worked with the spectrum of folks who have been forced into informal and formal labor, not just undocumented folks, or sex workers, but just folks sort of running across the labor spectrum. What's happened is this bifurcation, this hierarchy of who deserves more services and how we access those services. And, one thing is to be able to support and advocate for particular policies and even funding. When it comes to practicing and doing the service delivery work, the reality is very different, right? We are finding ourselves competing for the same shelter placement, for the same housing stipends, for the same employment and social services benefits. So really, it has created, in many ways, what we had hoped would increase and would create more pathways to being able to get the needs and the resources and really change the conditions of folks to be able to not be in exploitative conditions or even in vulnerable conditions, as we recognize the vulnerability still remains. And so while someone may not want to continue to engage in the sex trades, for example, the reality is much different, right? There's so much discrimination, especially for trans women, who are in our communities, who discrimination is really high, right? For undocumented women as well, and also often the employment access that is afforded to folks does not actually provide a living wage, right? And so we have to have these real conversations around how do we support within these formal systems of nonprofit service delivery with the reality of what people's needs really are, right? And so the conversations, the narratives around we must hyper criminalize and focus on one side first, when not actually meaningfully building a robust system of care, really has impacted the outcomes of people both across the spectrum.
Thank you, Jessica. And just pulling a recommendation that came out of our report on Common Cause. Again, this was a pilot project. I'll just actually explain it. Actually, no, I'm gonna have Melodie explain it. But if that's cool with you, Melodie. But one of the recommendations that everybody could agree on was that everybody in the sex trade deserves access to culturally competent, comprehensive care, regardless of whether they are trading or selling sex still. So Melodie, if you are available, I just saw you go off your camera, but could you describe for the audience what this Common Cause project was and why we did it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Savannah alluded to earlier, there's this debate, this long-standing debate within feminism and other spaces that posits that sex work is all sex work is exploitative and can never be a quote unquote consensual job, right? And that the whole thing should be abolished through criminalization of the sex trade, right? So that's sort of one aspect of the camp. The other aspect of this debate, the other side, if you will, is that sex work is work and can even be empowering and should not be criminalized for consensual adult workers, right? And we, as sex workers and as folks with lived experience, know that the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? That there's not one lived experience that covers the entire spectrum, nor should inform solely policy for how to regulate the sex trade. There's a messy middle. There are nuances to this debate. Some folks see the value in fully criminalizing each and every part and aspect of the sex trade, including the workers themselves. Some folks see value in completely abolishing all laws that govern the consensual sex trade. And again, we're talking about the consensual part here, right? So, this rift in feminism, largely caused by the kind of proliferation of this idea that all sex work is sex trafficking, that sex trafficking is kind of the only paradigm that exists within this realm, and and that coming up against consensual sex workers who feel very, very differently, right? And so us being in this work, being community activists and also people with lived experience and in community with other people with this lived experience, us being in this role at New Moon decided it's really time to come together and to start to work on things that we know matter to all of us. We care about the same people, we care about the same issues, and sometimes we are the same people. And that's just something that is true. Sometimes people who are trafficked into sex work end up becoming consensual sex workers later, or vice versa. And so in order to really help articulate that, we launched this Common Cause initiative. It was funded very modestly by a loving and nice like foundation who gave us the chance to really demonstrate a proof of concept around, can folks from these two like polar opposite ends of this debate, can we come together, have meaningful dialogue, and move forward on shared values, maybe shared language, and potentially shared policy around the sex trade? Because, as again, folks were alluding to earlier, we all agree, and we found through this project, we all agree that no matter what your relationship is to the sex trade, that you should have access to basic resources. You should have access to housing. You should be able to keep your kids without being afraid of losing custody because of an arrest. You should be able, as a sex worker or a person who has been, trafficked into sex work, be able to move forward with your life without a criminal record. We should be allowed to engage in public systems and even, interact with the police without them being allowed to have sex with us, which they currently are. And so this project really brought together several individuals from each side of the debate to come together under the really incredible facilitation of Reframe Health and Justice, so Jessica and her consulting firm, to identify those shared values and to put together this really lovely report that brought folks with lived experience, with opposing views on policy, to show us how we can start to move forward, and ultimately move to protect the people who we are and who we care about and who we intermingle with in community. And so that's what this was all about. And we're really hoping that folks can see this report, learn from it, and start to internalize their own dialogue around what sex work is, what sex trafficking is, and what policies we are moving forward to either punish or protect or empower people.
Thank you, Melodie. There's a lot of reasons why we did this pilot project. One is because this debate has literally been having for decades within feminism, and we are deeply divided on it, and this is not a time for division. Also, we see so much division in the country, and we felt that in our own small microcosm, perhaps we could try to build relationship beyond disagreement, which might be something that we could stand as a society on many levels right now. Also, we know that the debate within feminism with competing policy priorities confuses policymakers who don't always want to engage at all on the subject because they see it as a core constituency as infighting. Also with funders, it leads to funders maybe sometimes being reticent to fund either issue because they don't want to be seen as taking a side. Also, it leads to pendulum swinging. One side wins, and then a few years later, the other side wins and erases the work of the other, and then the other side wins. And it's a huge, huge drain on our time and energy and resources. Also, it's frankly traumatic for a lot of us. I noticed that logging into this Zoom today, my heart rate was, my heart was pounding. I do a lot of public speaking. I'm not afraid of talking to an audience, but on this topic, as a person with lived experience, this debate of invalidating each other, trying to one-up each other with data, trying to be right and fighting with other people with lived experience in the sex trade has been traumatic for me and for other advocates that I know, including people who oppose me, right? We can't even talk to each other because we're like enemies in a camp. And that is really unfortunate because together we do possess a lot of knowledge about how to keep women and girls safe, harm reduction, community networks of care, things that like Jessica was talking about with like direct service provision, record expungement. And also it's not a black and white issue. It's just really not. And today we're not going to get into the nuances of all of that. But I just wanted to say that. And also if I'm bouncing around, it's because I am nervous. These spaces make me nervous, even though I'm generally a really confident public speaker. Want to turn it back to Jessica. You were one of the facilitators for the Common Cause pilot program, and we were immensely grateful to get to work with you and your colleagues at Reframe Health and Justice. Can you share what that experience was like, working with 6 advocates with lived experience in the sex trade who may have opposing views? What was the process like?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So it was much like kind of what we're seeing and even I'm having a felt sense of what's even happening in the chat in this moment, right? And folks also coming with trepidation, but folks, again, like I said earlier in my introduction, wanting to take that risk and have the courage to actually turn to one another, right? And to be in that practice of conversation. And our focus and our reflection was that the more we created space to slow it down, to create a container where folks were in a much more intimate space where there was no set outcome, right? There was not an outcome of we're either going to be pro or end, or anybody's going to convince anybody to come to either side. The only goal was to be in true conversation and to hear each other and be in that active listening and active practice of conversation. And also to create a space to build each other's skills and muscle around that, right? And finding alignment on our shared values, and folks remaining through those discomforts and creating a space of care, right? So the way that we designed the facilitation, the cohort, we're together for 6 months, and it was shaped in a way where we were prioritizing safety and care of all participants, including us as facilitators, right? And having grounding practices, thinking about what are your safety and care plans as you come into this conversation? What do you need to be able to be most present and your best self in this conversation, and recognizing that that looks different for everybody and being able to engage, right? And when we are in having some challenging disagreement, what are our community agreements? And so we really, really practice community agreements, right? And so I'm sure there are community agreements that you all are holding and access needs in your conference this weekend. And what often happens is that we set community agreements, but then we don't actually think about what is our responsibility collectively and our accountability to actually be holding those community agreements. What Beyond the Binary in this cohort through Common Cause did was actually bring us into a slowing down and a reflection of being in those practices of how we're going to be in relationship with one another in this sub-community that we were building regardless of difference. And we were, asking people to lean into that discomfort and thinking about and reflecting, how can we stay connected to each other and to the communities that we represent without this, fear and all the other voices, right? Like, what is your voice? One of the things that we also found was that folks across the spectrum of advocacy and policy goals were again, all these people were folks with lived experience. Either they had experiences of trafficking, were actively sex workers, former sex workers, or not, across kind of that spectrum, but everybody had lived experience. And what emerged, and as you can see in the report, was some recommendations to the movement. And one of the things that we talked about actively was like, in which way can you take what we have discussed here and talk through to your movement, whether that's the pro-decrim movement or the Nordic model movement, right? Around how we are harming each other in conversations, right? And can we be ambassadors of just being in more generative conflict, right? And so we grounded this space also in a practice of generative conflict, to what Savannah is saying. Like, conflict and disagreement will always happen. It is part of being human. It's also part of our ability to build our skills to be able to agree to disagree, but also not create more harm, right? And so what do these larger, models of accountability to ourselves and mostly to the communities that we are advocating, because we have a responsibility, and folks are noting that they have a responsibility, right? To folks that are trafficked, to folks that are, wanting, different policy needs or asks. And ultimately, how do we share that brilliance and that care and that leadership? And what we found is that those folks shared how there were so many personalities that were kind of informing and kind of coloring the ways in which they can actually have an active voice, right? And so it was often those that maybe were on a higher pedestal, maybe had more airtime, and not even being able to disagree because we're so kind of our heels are, really dug into our position, that there is no movement to move, and folks feeling really also concerned about being able to disagree within their movements as well, right? And so that signaled to us as facilitators and folks that were responsible for the care of the space that we need to really build that skill, and we need to think about what do we need to, as Savannah said, kind of lay down a little bit more of that barrier and those walls. And often when we are creating those, it's because we feel protective and we feel some feelings of unsafety, right? And so what do you need individually to feel safe, right? We did some skill building as well. Often advocates were also telling us that they felt in some ways really used by both sides, around like just being put as folks that were talking about their lived experiences, but not paid adequately, not given adequate access to, different opportunities, and kind of just being seen as folks that can only contribute to their respective movement from their lived experience and the worst parts of them, right? And they actually are advocates that had incredible ideas, as you can see in the report, and just needed a space to actually be able to think about that in a more meaningful way. And so we learned that at the end of the day, in both movements, and even folks that were somewhere in between, there was a lack of care and intention and safety that was emerging, where their leadership with, again, folks that are most directly impacted should be the folks that are also leading that, while also recognizing that we have created kind of a system where we have also put folks with lived experience in a particular box, right? And we don't see them beyond that. And so that was some things that emerged against. This was a smaller group, and that was intentional. That was intentional so that we can actually have the safety and care, created in the space.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, we highly recommend checking out the report. It's really short. Again, this was a pilot project. It was an experiment, but we feel that there really is legs to this and to, as Jessica said, generative conflict. Melodie, I wanted to ask if you had any further thoughts to share, and then I was thinking of reading the 5 or 6 policy recommendations that came from these 6 advocates in the Common Cause Initiative, and then maybe opening it to a question or two if we have time. But Melodie, is there anything that you'd like to add or anything that hasn't been discussed yet?
Yeah, I'm going through the catalog of things that I could say about this, but I think what's most important, and as I'm also kind of seeing what's happening in the chat, I really want folks in this room to understand that a lot of folks' hesitation or knee-jerk reactions around this topic is based in fear and trauma. And it's valid. And what we've done with this report is really create a framework for how to step out of that fear and that gut reaction that we have to things that are uncomfortable, to like really authentically try to move forward as a movement. We are losing because we give in to our own fear about talking about a thing. And this is not just about sex work and sex trafficking. Other things make us really uncomfortable too, right? Like the Palestinian genocide made a lot of us really uncomfortable to talk about. But it's so important to lean into uncomfortable conversations, especially as we're thinking about feminism, y'all, because that's the start of real progress. Like, we cannot move forward on any given issue unless we talk about it, unless we create a container to talk about it respectfully, healthily, and from a place where we can be vulnerable and also be safe. So that's what we have done. Other folks have done it as well, in terms of creating this container. But I really, really want everyone in this room to understand that it doesn't matter what the specific thing is we're talking about. If we don't get past our ability to just talk to each other about what's going on, then the feminism is incomplete. It's incomplete without all of the conversations that we aren't having. So again, thank you for hearing this, and we really hope that you start to internalize like what can be possible if we just take a moment to breathe and work with each other, because that's the only way we can move forward.
Thanks, Melodie. I agree with that. And also, in the spirit of common cause, I'm about to read some of the recommendations that came out of the report. But I want to acknowledge my own journey on this. I've been a staunch advocate for sex workers' rights and the full decriminalization of sex work, because that's just my experience and what aligns with me. And I recognize that in the past, especially as a grassroots advocate without a lot of policy advocacy experience and just a lot of like emotion and personal experience. I've also experienced exploitation in the sex trade, and I have witnessed sex trafficking. That the way that I come into the space may have been harmful to advocates who disagree with me. I have felt harmed in this debate, and part of this process is acknowledging that harm. I acknowledge my own harm that I may have caused to other advocates, especially survivors of sex trafficking who disagree with me, just through my words, my firmness, and being on a side that I want to win. I am shedding that. because I want to link arms with other feminists anywhere possible. And so I apologize to anybody who's ever felt harmed by my advocacy. So now we're going to read some of the recommendations in the report. And just to make it clear, like the things that we disagree on, I think there are like 3 things that these 2 camps disagree on. 1, is there such a thing as sex work? Can sex work ever be a legitimate form of labor, or is it just paid rape? That's something that we debate. You know, that's the big one. Another thing, can people who purchase sexual services be anything other than predators? Some of us call them clients. Some of us call them all rapists. You know, we debate on the who those people are, right? We also debate on the role of third parties. This could be a strip club, a porn set, a booking agent, an exploiter, a trafficker, you know, a third parties, anybody facilitating the thing. Can they be anything other than exploitative? Those are the 3 things that I think we really spend decades fighting over. Those 3 things. But now we're going to share 5 or 6 policy recommendations that are just the tip of the iceberg. This was a 6-session pilot series. When I share these things, I find them inspiring. I want to work with people who disagree with me on these important policy priorities because they will lead to a tangible, positive difference in the lives of people in the sex trade. And that's actually a nice neutral term for shared language. People in the sex trade, people with lived experience in the sex trade. We're not describing or assuming their experience, but we are acknowledging that they are in the sex trade and we care about them. We all care about them. So here are the recommendations. All people deserve access to a diverse set of non-judgmental and affirming services, regardless of their lived experience and respect for self-identification, and without conditions of involvement in criminal legal proceedings or to stop trading sex. Funding should seek to transparently support culturally responsive services to groups disproportionately impacted by exploitation, including communities of color and trans communities. Second recommendation. Robust, long-term, and ongoing quality health care should be free and accessible to all people, including those without documentation or irregular migration status. Notice how that one has nothing to do with the sex trade, but we all thought it was so important that we wanted to put it as a recommendation. 3, we categorically oppose the expansion of criminalization for the people who sell sex. We recommend that jurisdictions allocate and/or expand funding and resources for people looking to leave the sex trade and for those looking to create safety under criminalization while trading sex. Law enforcement should be banned from engaging in any sexual contact with a potential witness, victim, victim offender, or perpetrator during investigations of a crime. Can we all work on that together? Yes, we can. Access to affordable and free housing should be expanded for individuals with lived experience in the sex trades, because we recognize that housing is fundamental to deterring exploitation. Prostitution and solicitation should not be deportable offenses. So those are the couple of recommendations that came out of this 6-session pilot program. I want to thank my colleague Melodie KG for walking on this journey with me and making this possible. And I want to thank Jessica and her colleagues at Reframe Health and Justice for doing this. And I want to thank the 6 brave advocates who came into some Zoom rooms together for 6 sessions to try and build that bridge. So now we have like 15 minutes. We could keep yakking at you, but we would like to open it up to questions. Also, I want to say that I personally am not here to debate about the sex trades. I'm more interested in this common cause conversation if any of this resonates with you. If you have your own personal experiences with this debate and how it's impacted you or your work, really interested in hearing. I see France Giddings raising her hand.
Hi. My chapter has had quite a bit of well, we went through an educational program a couple of years ago with documentaries and various things. And now there's been a focus on making sure, of course, that the women in the sex trade are decriminalized, but that the focus is, I guess, the Nordic model, which I'm still a little ambivalent about. But I am very, very strong when you talk about police officers. I was an investigator for public defense for almost 28 years, and I was very aware of what police officers consider the perks of their jobs. And it's just, I mean, it's made me really anti-cop in a way that sometimes my friends can't handle at all, because I feel so strongly about the ways that they take advantage. They also really exploit overtime and another bunch of stuff like that. But I think that that in particular, I would really be absolutely for, and bring back to my chapter in a way that I've been sort of staying back and being quiet in other conversations.
And France, can you tell us what chapter you're a part of?
Seattle.
Seattle, great. Seattle's where I did all my advocacy, and there's certainly some hot conversations happening now, but they're in some ways the same conversations that have been happening for a long time. And I'm going to Seattle tomorrow, and I would be wholeheartedly supportive of you talking to your colleagues at your NOW chapter about this issue of police violence. Because again, like as a sex worker, I live in total fear of the police. I am afraid of police violence. I know so many people who have experienced police violence and exploitation. I know trafficking survivors who have been abused by the police. This is something we can all get behind. And why would we be wasting our time and energy fighting each other over the things we know we disagree on when we could all be working on that? So thank you, France. I really, really appreciate that comment and thought. And let us know if we can be supportive of you in your conversations about having, like, identifying these kind of common cause things.